Hey everyone, my name is Cal Walters, and what you're about to watch or listen to is by far the most important podcast episode I've ever done. This is really more than an episode. This is meant to be a tribute to Chris Goeke, a dear friend, leader, and inspiration to everyone that knew him. Even from a young age, Chris was adventurous, and he was born to be a leader. He grew up in Apple Valley, Minnesota, where he loved building forts in the woods behind his house, and he often gathered and encouraged his friends. He excelled in school through all of his years, and he was active in music, mock trial, and various sports. As he grew older, his faith in God grew, and he participated in many church activities and mission trips. He was accepted into West Point with the class of 2008, where he graduated 6th in his class. And then after college, Chris was commissioned as an infantry officer, and he completed Airborne school and Army Ranger school. Chris married the love of his life, Kelsey, and they settled into life at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where Chris joined Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the 82nd Airborne, on May 18th, 2009. And then in September of 2009, Chris deployed with his unit to Afghanistan, where he would lead a platoon in combat. Then on Tuesday, July 13th, 2010, Chris was killed in action while repelling an insurgent attack on an Afghan police compound in Kandahar City. 10 years after his death, we come together to remember Chris and honor his lasting impact on all of our lives. We celebrate a man that made us laugh, think deeper, feel special, believe in ourselves, grow in our faith, and live more intentionally. Chris, we love you and we miss you. You truly were the best among us, and we carry you with us wherever we go. Jenny Huff is Chris's sister. She's the events and website coordinator for the Minneapolis Area Synod and lives in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area.
Being really little, he would beat us up all the time. And we had all of our little, so we had an older brother and I have a twin sister, and we all had our little techniques that we knew would irk the other one the most. And so, my sister and I would always hold hands and say, double, double trouble, and run and try to attack Chris. And that was a big part of growing up with Chris. And, he was always a prankster in school, and he would bring that home too. And so he'd get in trouble for that at school, and then he'd get in trouble for that at home. So he was always playing little tricks on us and stuff. He was also always playing with his army men, and he had a tree fort in the backyard, and he had full, I don't even know what you would call it, but army men built up, and they had a whole battle going on, and it was days long battle, and he knew where they all would go and everything. So I feel the army was just in his blood. And he always wanted to play Risk, and he'd always beat everyone at Risk, and it was so annoying. Yeah, but just, he was good at everything, and it was kind of that always growing up trying to live up to him kind of thing. But as he got older and he sort of found his faith, he changed a lot, and he became a lot more loving. And he was just growing up, I'm sure too, but he cared a lot more about us and what we were feeling, what we were going through. And one thing in particular for me is that Chris and I often used to work out together, and Chris would always encourage me and help set up workout plans and running plans and stuff like that for me, which is a big reason why I'm doing the 5K thing, because that's a thing that we would do together. And so actually before his deployment, he came home and he intentionally had one-on-one time with each family member, which just says a lot about him and how much he cares about his family. And, he just really, his relationships, and he just really wanted to spend that time with each of us, and just ask questions and just, have some quality memories and stuff. And him and I went to the gym, and we talked about stuff I was like, what if you die? And he's like, he said, I'm a soldier, I'm trained not to die. Right. But like just real questions, and he would totally like entertain that stuff. And we talked a lot about our faith. We had a really close bond about that, and that was something that for him kind of came into his life in high school. And he ended up going to the same church that my sister and I were going to already with some friends, and we like just totally bonded over that too. And so as he was older and like at West Point and stuff, we would talk all the time, like share scriptures and pray together and stuff like that. So yeah, those are a few things. But he was such a protector. We grew up in kind of a tough family situation, and he was always watching out for me and my sister, and checking in on us and stuff. And yeah, and he was so funny. And he would just like sit around playing his guitar, making up songs about whatever was happening around him in the room, and just some of the stuff that came out of his head. It's like, where the heck did that come from? But it was fun. We just laughed together a lot. And the four of us kids had a really close bond. And yeah, it was pretty awesome.
Erin Jork Lavoie is one of Chris's friends from childhood and school. She is now a yoga and movement teacher and lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Chris and I grew up together. We lived in the same neighborhood. He just lived down the street from me. And so he was one of my earliest friends. Early on, Chris kind of lived to pester me. He had a big crush on me. So like he would sit with me on the school bus, and I would, for no reason, I would just cry because I didn't want Chris Goeke to sit next to me. And he would try and impress me by reenacting scenes from movies like Dumb and Dumber and Wayne's World. He knew a lot about The Simpsons. For whatever reason, this memory always sticks with me. We were in first grade, the same class of first grade, and we had like vocabulary days, and we would have these flashcards with the specific words, and our teacher asked us to hold up the word but, B-U-T, and everyone in the class holds their flashcard up, and of course Chris had to add an additional T to the word but, and he thought it was so funny. In middle school, Chris and I, we became friends. It was less of Chris pestering me, and we became more friendly. And I just remember like sitting at the park in our neighborhood for hours at night, and we would just talk. And I remember thinking, he's so smart, and he's so much smarter than me. And I don't know half the things he's talking about, but I know it's important, and I know I should listen. Like giving me life advice, in sixth grade. God, he was so smart. In high school, we were in a variety show performance together, and senior year, he was playing the drums on the song "Come Sail Away," and he like halfway, through the song, he like rips his shirt in half. And so I think my big takeaway from Chris, and that I try to remember into adulthood, is that you can be really smart, and you can be very insightful. But at the same time, it's really important to be kind, and it's really important to like not take yourself too seriously. Because Chris was always so funny. He would always kind of lighten the situation. Although like he had really deep things to share, it always stayed really light.
Scott Wiggin is one of Chris's childhood friends. He's now an additive manufacturing research engineer at Collins Aerospace and lives in Eagan, Minnesota.
I've been friends with Chris since we were in second grade. I truly feel lucky to have been friends with Chris. Really, really an honor to know him, be friends with him. He was just, simply put, he was just the best friend anybody could really ever ask for. What I'll remember most about Chris is that he was hilarious. He made me laugh harder than just about anybody. He could make anything funny, any activity funny. Everything from, we played tennis, and we were doubles partners, and we'd always be kind of goofing around on the court, or like we thought it was kind of fun to wear like a ton of bandanas and wristbands and kind of goof off, and maybe goofed off a little too much, and that's why we weren't very good tennis players. But he loved The Simpsons, and so he was always quoting The Simpsons when he was younger, and basically knew every episode by heart. He was just, simply put, just the funniest guy I had ever met. Just after hanging out with him, your gut always kind of hurt from laughing so hard. But at the same time, he knew how to like flip the switch and be this very serious guy and have really good conversations. I think he liked the debate kind of almost more than anything, and so you'd oftentimes be like having a discussion or a debate about something, and he'd all of a sudden flip sides, and he'd just start arguing the other point. And I think he did it just because he liked the debate, he liked the discussion, he liked getting you to think about both sides of the issue. He liked, kind of boxing you in some sort of little, trapping you in whatever your opinion is. And he was really good at it. But you'd always come away from this conversation on nearly any topic feeling like you understood better, you had a new viewpoint, you learned something. And so, there's a lot of things in the world and in family life or my kids that really, I wish I could, have that debate with him and get his opinions and see how he'd get me thinking about things in a little different way. Growing up, Chris and I were a lot of different activities together. Ultimate Frisbee was just one that I just really have so many fond memories of. Mock trials, another that all throughout high school, being on the same, we're on the same mock trial team, and we're typically kind of the mock trial lawyers, and so that's something that always makes me think of Chris as well. One thing about Chris that I always think about is he would have been so successful in anything that he did. He was brilliant, and he could have been anything from a philosopher, musician, engineer, lawyer, anything. But he was such a natural leader that West Point and the military just really kind of were a natural fit for him. It was kind of funny, knowing him from the time that we were so little and then watching us become, adults. He was always a leader, and he was always getting people, kind of follow him just naturally. When we were kids, it would often lead to some mischief and, doing something weird and some scheming and some, thwart or some prank that we're pulling on somebody. But then when he, as he grew up and became the man that he became, clearly took that in a really more impactful route in the military, and it's just really not surprising at all that he decided to go to West Point and then was incredibly successful there, just being how smart he was, how great a leader, and he was quite the athlete as well.
Rick Ferreira is one of Chris's high school friends. He's now a solar power plant manager and lives in Oakland, California.
I met him about 20 years ago, almost exactly, actually, in the fall of 2000 at football practice before ninth grade started. Him and a bunch of his friends had come from a middle school that I didn't go to, so it was a whole new group of people and friends. And what I remember most about him, almost right from the beginning there, it was around the time, some people might remember, it was around the time when the XFL, I think it was the Extreme Football League, was starting. And Chris was trying to round people up to watch it. And I don't actually really recall ever watching more than maybe one game, if that. I don't know if there ever was any more than that. But, right from the beginning, the beginning of when I knew him, at least in ninth grade, Chris, what I remember is that he, was always organizing people to do things. He was always trying to find opportunities for people to sit down together and talk to each other and do something interesting. The qualities that stood out the most to me about Chris, I'd have to say curiosity is the word I'm looking for. curiosity and connection. He was, always trying to spend time with people, trying to talk to people about big questions. And like I said, always trying to do new things. One thing that really sticks out to me is that when I'm in my hometown, where we grew up, there's this road that passes by some unused or undeveloped land. It's just forested. I'm not sure if it's a park or what, but I mean, most people probably just drive by without thinking. But for whatever reason, one day, probably after 10th grade or after 11th grade, Chris called me and wanted to go for a walk or something. And we went there and we found these two trees you could climb up and sit maybe head level off the ground, maybe 6 feet up, I don't know, 10 to 15 feet apart from each other. And I just, remember all these funny things about Chris, including that, he would want to just go play outside, walk in the woods, climb trees, even well into high school or later.
Major Mary Alice Noel is one of Chris's West Point classmates. She's now an Army doctor and lives in Columbus, Georgia.
Chris is very intentional. And it's something that I find that I love about my own husband that I have now. Just this intentionality of every time you spoke with him, it was not a lighthearted conversation. It usually got pretty serious pretty quick. And he really wanted to know how you were doing. If he asked how you were doing, he meant, how are you doing? And he wouldn't let things slide because he cared so deeply about people. So one of the stories that really reminds me of Chris's character and his intentionality was during our freshman year. I got really busy with everything. I was on the crew team and had a lot of other requirements from school, as many of us did. And so I stopped attending Tuesday night OCF, the Officers Christian Fellowship Bible study, and he noticed. And one evening, I don't remember how we came to meet up, but he met me. We were outside the library, and he gave me a copy of My Utmost for His Highest. And then he also gave me a letter and a little circle that said "Around to It," the TUIT. And it was an encouraging letter to remember what my calling was first to Christ. And to remember that in the midst of all the busyness, that our commitment to Christ is the most important thing. And he encouraged me to step up, to lead my classmates, as I kind of started with that fervor and passion at the beginning of our freshman year, to step up and lead again, and to not let all those extra things pull me away from what was the most important. And that was the most, I still have that letter. It's in a scrapbook downstairs, and I recently came across it, and just how much someone would care. We had known each other for 6 months. I'd never had a Christian brother before who had demonstrated such care as to take time to write a letter to me personally, give me a copy of a tremendous devotional that stuck with me through, I would say, the next probably 7 or 8 years. I used that devotional regularly. And he had that ability to see, I guess, potential or get to see, what people could be, and he'd push people towards that. And I know he did that in all areas of his life, not just in his Christian community. But that intentionality of communication was really powerful, to the point where he gave us all CDs of recordings of himself with songs that he wrote, which is probably one of the most incredible gifts that I've ever received, is getting to have his voice, to hear. We spent so many, random nights with him pulling his guitar and just playing and singing, especially when we were seniors. And so that was just really neat. I remember seeing his studio at Bragg that he had created with Kelsey. And Chris's ability to communicate intentionally to people came in many forms and fashions. And that's really has stuck with me my entire life. I'll never forget it. It was the first time I'd been called in a sense of accountability. One of the verses in Hebrews that it reminds me of Hebrews 10, 20, starting in 23, let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. And that verse of, don't forget to spur one of each other on, to gather together. It's so important. And that rings so true in our lives today as we are members of our Christian community, and that is the lifeblood of where we get encouragement. We are admonished and we're encouraged, and it's really tremendous that he, at the young age of what we were 18, already understood that. And I remember Chaplain Lindenmeyer always talking about how he was always wise beyond his years, and that was true. That he had lived almost so much more life. By the time the Lord took him, I think he had lived so much of the life that I feel like I'm mature enough now to see 10 years later. He had so much of that maturity.
Kimberly Jung is one of Chris's West Point classmates. She is the former CEO of Roomy Spice and currently lives in Boston, Massachusetts.
Chris Goeke and I were in the same company at West Point, Company B1, Barbarians, and we were in the same B Squad. I remember Chris having to eat peanut butter out of a spoon a certain way for the squad leader, and all the times that we did lots of push-ups and sit-ups and carrying heavy stuff together for Beast. And we also did Buckner together as well. And I remember that Chris was always making sure that he could carry other people's loads in addition to his own. Chris has always been a leader from a very early age, and he showed that when he was always supporting other people. And I remember also when I was on Sandhurst team and I was running the course, and my father was there as well, and Chris was also running behind the team, and my dad told me that Chris was right behind him the whole time to make sure that my dad wouldn't trip and fall, and that really touched me for a very long time. I also distinctly remember when I was kind of pushing away my faith, and I was sharing that with Chris, and he came to my room every night for 1 week and shared scripture with me and did some biblical readings. And I remember thinking, why are you doing this? You have so much on your plate. I think he was doing brigade duties at that time already in the leadership positions, and we had so many classes and extracurricular activities to finish, and yet Chris took the time and the energy to come to my room as a good friend and to share his faith and share scripture with me. And that stuck with me for a while.
Major Kevin Canary is one of Chris's West Point classmates. He is now an Army surgeon and lives in New York City.
He's one of the most multi-dimensional people I've ever known. But there's one thing that really stuck out to me to this day that still kind of penetrates me when I think about Chris is the one word I would use to describe him would be thoughtful. This kind of makes sense. He was a philosophy major. But for those people out there who didn't know him, he wasn't a philosophy major that was, in it for the easy grades. He was acing his engineering courses better than all the rest of us and math and sciences. But he just, everything that he encountered or interacted with, he thought to understand it. This is something that I didn't appreciate back then, and I've learned to appreciate more over time. He was open-minded, and a lot of times this irritated me. We would have conversations, and, I don't know if it's something about being 18, 19, maybe I'm just unique, but I was very kind of dogmatic about beliefs back then. And Chris just would not accept the narratives that I had accepted, and he would challenge me on them and on many different things. And I remember being like, man, this guy, he I don't know why he doesn't just accept things for how they are. Like, this is the truth. And it's taken me years to realize how far ahead he was of me as far as thinking and understanding and not accepting the narrative. He always would challenge it. It's like, I even remember, I've talked to his wife, Kelsey, about this, his wife, whether it's his religion, his politics, but he also examined the love of his wife to the point of to her and to us. And after he was married and why do we do this? Why do I love her? Is this really a thing? Just things that the rest of us accept and go on in life with, but Chris, that wasn't Chris. And so yeah, that's really kind of the biggest thing that sticks out to me is his thoughtfulness.
Quinn MacArthur is one of Chris's West Point classmates. He's a former Green Beret and now works in real estate development in Orlando, Florida.
We both branched infantry, so we went through officer basic courses together in Ranger School, and then went on to our first assignment as platoon leaders at the 82nd, where we cut the tail end of the train up with our respective units before deploying to Iraq, generally about the same time. So a quick story about Chris that I think will resonate with those who knew him well. I can't remember what exact training exercise it was, but we were out in the woods somewhere at Fort Benning, and we'd been out for several days, and the instructors had called a pause to the exercise. So we were taking a break, and we were all filling up our water, cleaning up or whatever, and all of us were a little dirty, not too bad though, and we all generally looked the same with dirt here and there, kind of what you'd expect. Everyone was a little dirty and hungry and unhappy. Everyone's a little ticked off that we're still out there. And that's everyone except for Chris. He was probably the exact opposite of what I just described. I came across Chris. We were at like a water station filling up water, and I saw him. And first, he wasn't just a little dirty here and there. He looked like an absolute disaster. There was mud caked on his face for some reason. His uniform was in shambles. Equipment had straps everywhere. His pack and his kit just all over the place. But that was just him. He was probably out working hard somewhere and helping somebody. He was just a mess. But he was smiling, and he didn't really care. And his attitude was somehow upbeat and cheery. He was engaging, and he actually wanted to talk to other people. And that's just who he was. The situation and the actual circumstances came second. And I think Chris just had a way of prioritizing more important things. Rewinding a little bit back to West Point, Chris and I would meet weekly for a good portion of our time at school. We'd pray together, we'd read scripture, but most of the time we'd discuss some of the content of the books that we'd been reading. And as many know, Chris was kind of on another level intellectually. So naturally his books were way smarter, deeper, and just very philosophical. We'd often get a laugh, honestly, at how little I had to, how much I had to pretend that what he was even talking about half the time. But we always met up despite our busy schedules. We shared a passion for C.S. Lewis's works, and it was really during those times and these discussions that I really learned about Chris's character and how he thought and how he viewed the world. And I also learned how good of a communicator he was. He was probably one of the best listeners that I've ever met. Just the way he communicated was so intentional. What he said, what questions he'd ask, the intensity with how he listened. You just really don't see that. And he truly cared for what was being said, and he had a hunger to learn and to grow. He wanted to understand the meaning and the purposes of what you were saying. And I think this is such an uncommon trait, is really why it stood out to me. And at the end of the day, what made Chris so unique in this way is that he had the Spirit of Christ living in him. And it was just so apparent. He was a very strong Christian believer, and his faith was rooted deeply in Scripture, and he lived that out. He lived out that Christ-like example of what it looks like to really lean into relationships, listen intently, love Christ, and love others really well. Without a doubt, his example to me in this way was absolutely how Chris changed my life, and just one of the many reasons why I will miss him.
John Bockstans is one of Chris's West Point classmates. He now works at Facebook and lives in Austin, Texas.
I became close friends with Chris during our plebe year at West Point in 2004. Like most cadets, Chris always impressed me with how he was driven for a purpose greater than himself. And there are a lot of really impressive people at West Point, but Chris truly stood out as someone who was just seemingly good at everything that he did. He was a straight-A student. He was so strong and fit that he could embarrass me in the gym. He was this talented musician, and on and on. But what really made Chris unique is that he had a passion for living authentically and for learning and for reading and for learning and understanding how other people think. Not just what they think, but why and what drove them. And a great example I have of this is that I remember one weekend at West Point, Chris was really excited to bring together a group of friends to watch this documentary DVD that he had just picked up. This is before the days of YouTube and Netflix, where it was easy to just scroll and find any documentary that you might want to watch. But instead, Chris sought this one out because it was a discussion all about how science and religion kind of teach us the way we know the things that we know, and explanate in a discussion of whether or not these things are true. And I remember this so clearly because this documentary was weird. The ideas, I had no idea who these people were. I didn't understand a lot of it. But Chris wasn't trying to tell us what to think. He wasn't trying to persuade us. Instead, he was just excited to see how we thought about it, and if we disagreed with something, why. Chris was just excited to learn alongside us. And Chris wasn't always understood. He wasn't the type of person who fit into any one person's expectations or mold, but that didn't matter to him. Chris wasn't trying to fit in, or he wasn't worried about his image. Instead, I saw him live a life where he just wanted to serve and love those around him. And he pulled together a community through our time at West Point. Many of these friends are still my closest friends to this day, who on a regular basis, weekly, we'd come together to talk about what matters most in life. We'd talk about religion and who we wanted to be as men. And I saw Chris's just servant heart in no better way than the way he treated his wife, Kelsey, who was just his perfect match in her intellect and her ability. And I loved sharing life with Chris.
Rajiv Srinivasan is one of Chris's West Point classmates. He now works at LinkedIn and lives in San Francisco, California.
My favorite memory of Chris Goeke is no doubt our time together at Air Assault School at Fort Drum. And the context was that we both actually failed out of Air Assault School the first time, and we were sitting there demoralized, wondering how we're going to get a chance to prove ourselves again. And we ended up getting lucky, found slots at Fort Drum, we ship up on there, and it was grueling, it was hard, it was stressful, and every step of the way, Chris Goeke was there with me, encouraging me, helping me train and get better at these very tedious skills that were so detail-oriented, but you could just see this determination and passion that would just elevate me to become the best version of myself. I also remember during that time, he was corresponding with this strange girl named Kelsey that he had just met. And you could see it in his excitement every time she came up in conversation, just like how true that love was from the beginning. And I remember seeing him writing those letters with a little smile on his face. He was always in a cheery mood. And in many ways, I think Kelsey got him through that very grueling school. And then he got me through that very grueling school. So Kelsey, we all really thank you for helping us graduate.
Lance Dietz is one of Chris's West Point classmates. He's now a venture capitalist at KB Partners and lives in Chicago.
I'd like to share just a few stories about Chris that stick with me to this day and kind of influence my life going forward. First is when I got to meet Chris first year at West Point. We really only started to get to know each other senior year, our first year. And one of the first experiences was when we both had a duty shift at the Central Guard room and Chris was in charge. And I can remember coming away from that night thinking, wow, for a job, a duty, and an additional duty as crappy as sitting at a desk, making checks around the campus, Chris was very detailed, process oriented, and held a high standard. And, you know, to this day, that idea sticks with me. And is something I think about in all jobs I've had, you know, personally and professionally. Second story is when I went to Israel with Chris and a few other people, faith-related trip after graduation from West Point. We all went to Israel, and I can remember there being a very heated argument and debate around certain aspects of faith. And Chris, being a person who has very strong faith and is very deep into his faith. I can remember being incredibly surprised at how willing he was to dive into the other aspects of the argument, hear why people thought about things differently, and his desire to understand versus be right. And I think that really stuck with me. And I think it was an incredible sign of, one, wanting to learn, but two, and probably more importantly, wanting to build relationships with people and show love to others. So that's another thing that sticks with me. And lastly, just over a year later, at that time, Chris and I had ended up in Ranger School together, and we were in the last phase of Ranger School in Florida phase, and we ended up becoming best buddies there, Ranger buddies, shared every foxhole together. And I quickly realized at that point that Chris was going to be a best, longtime friend of mine from that point forward. When Chris died, I can remember Mary Alice Pass sending me an email with a letter or an essay that Chris had wrote reflecting on Ranger School, and she had mentioned that I was in it. And this was the day after Ranger School that he wrote this. And I was super excited to hear what he thought about us and our relationship. And the few sentences I got in this 5 to 6 page letter was him recalling a night in the foxhole where I was apparently crying hysterically because I missed my longtime girlfriend and family. And I don't think that's exactly how the story went, but regardless, what stuck with me about that is how reflective he was and how he was always journaling, was always finding time to take the experiences, the interactions that he had, and reflect on them and use those as learning points going forward in his life. And so those three things, all from Chris, stories that I can look back on.
Major James Booth is one of Chris's West Point classmates. He's now a lawyer in the Army and lives in Anchorage, Alaska.
Chris was honestly one of the most dynamic personalities I think that I ever knew. You know, on the one hand, he was so driven to succeed, kind of a leader amongst his peers. I remember one time, and this would have been before we graduated, about a group of 10 of us went down to New York City. It was about a week before graduation, and we went to a family-style Italian restaurant. It would have been, I think, Carmine's. And so we all sat around this table, and it was, like I said, about 10 of us with our girlfriends and our fiancés at the time. And I would say within 2 minutes of sitting down, he and my now brother-in-law Dan grabbed the menus, made some suggestions, elicited some feedback from the table, but pretty much decided what everybody at the table was going to eat for that night, long before the waitress could even come back and get our drink orders. And while 2 minutes might be a little bit of an exaggeration, I think the point still stands. Even at a table full of type A, soon to be West Point graduates, he was always kind of a step ahead, always out front, and that's kind of the personality that he was. But unlike so many people that are maybe naturally like that, or kind of the real go-getters of the world, Chris just had this uncanny, amazing ability to just slow down a conversation, just ask incredible, probing questions. I mean, I think he would have been an outstanding lawyer if that was something that he was interested in doing. He really just, at the end of the day, he had an ability to make a mundane topic really interesting and really personal, and just listen to what you had to say, and really just made you feel special, honestly. And that's what made him special, because he cared, and he communicated that he communicated that he cared in the way that he engaged with people even like myself, who admittedly probably didn't know him as well as some of the folks that you're interviewing.
I can remember hearing about Chris Gaike's death when I was in Afghanistan. I can remember the day. I think I found out through either text message or an email with the question, have you heard about Chris? And instantly kind of realized that he had passed away. And I remember looking over to the right and saying to my, at the time, platoon sergeant, I think one of my best friends had just been killed.
I have other memories of Chris where I remember seeing him on the base on Kandahar Airfield. I was actually on my way out of Afghanistan and he was coming in. And I remember on the day that I landed in Bangor, Maine, coming home from Kandahar, that's when I got the news that Chris had been killed. And that is always going to stick with me in the back of my mind because, to come home on American soil and for just a minute feeling safe, feeling relief, feeling so many wonderful emotions. And then to hear that one of my best friends just got killed, what it did for me is for the rest of my life, my heart's always going to be over there. It's just a constant reminder that no matter how safe or comfortable I may be, there's always someone I care about, someone who's serving on my behalf as a soldier that's overseas, that's doing something that I'm very glad that I do not have to do. And not to make light of Chris's passing, but if there's any silver lining to it, I think I'm probably more contextually aware of the people that are fighting and serving on my behalf than I would be otherwise. And especially as I move on into my civilian career, super far out from the military, that's just something that's always with me. I wear my bracelet every day. I have one for Chris Goeke, one for Andy Byers that I alternate through. And for the rest of my life, I'll always be thinking about those who are, serving on my behalf. And I really appreciate that. So lots of love to Kelsey, to Chris, to his entire family out in Minnesota. You raised an amazing young man. He's an inspiration to me 10 years ago. He's an inspiration to me today, and he will be for the rest of my life. So very grateful to have been a part of his life.
Even now, sometimes Chris comes into my dreams, and I remember there's times where, really tough times, and Chris has been there, and he said, Kim, you can do this. I got you. And I always felt like he was a team member, no matter where I went. And those dreams of him come very, very far and few between, but when they do, they make a really big difference. And I wake up feeling inspired and refreshed, and that's oftentimes what Chris does to people, is he inspires and refreshes people and makes you believe in something, because he always had that quality about him that you could look up to him, that he was there by your side, that he was working hard beside you. And I can attest to that because I was in the same B squad as him, and we watched each other grow up throughout West Point. And I wish very sorely that we could have seen what Chris could have become as a leader today.
Chris always wanted to go deeper. He always had another question, and he always had really, really good questions, to the point where my head would hurt sometimes, or I would just want to phase out of the conversation because I'm like, this has gone too deep too quickly. And interestingly, my husband is also one of those people who just will go deep and wants to go deep. And I think it exposed me to the fact that, the Christian life is there's so much in the Bible that we don't know. There's so much that we don't know just as surface. Like you just read it one time. There's depths to explore in the Bible and amongst our fellow believers. And so to keep going to deeper, that it's not wrong to ask questions, and that by asking questions, you really become closer to the Lord as you explore more of what the depths of the Bible has for you. So that has tremendous impact on my life today, as we teach our children the Bible, and as my husband and I interact with our community, to remember that, again, at a young age, Chris is asking some of these really deep questions that led him close to the Lord, that have, those questions have brought me closer to the Lord as well. And even through his death, brought me to a different point in my faith where I could ask some really hard questions of the Lord, which he answers in his word, and his promises are true and faithful. And the feeling of contentment or joy is so much deeper than happiness and just having everything go right in your life. So that's really what Chris has brought to my life.
I know that Chris has changed my life because he showed me that as long as I'm living for a purpose greater than myself, I don't need to worry about trying to fit into the expectations of what I think others want from me. Instead, he taught me to never stop learning and to just work as hard as I can for the things that matter, even if I'm not always understood. And he taught me to love and value those around me and what they think, even if I don't always understand them. 10 years later, after Chris's death, a lot still doesn't make sense to me. I don't know why he's not here anymore, and I am. But what I do know is that when we lost Chris, I vowed that I would live the rest of my life like every day counts. I vowed that I'd live a life that's authentic and true. And I want to live a life that I can be proud of, just like I can be, like I am so proud of the life that Chris lived. And I'm so proud to know that he's made that kind of impact on everyone who knew him.
When I think about him, and I try to be okay with not knowing. Chris was okay with that. Chris was okay with pondering, and he was okay with silence, and he was okay with kind of being uncomfortable, and because of his thinking. And so I'm really bad at that, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, though, in being quiet and pondering, and and just the tremendous loss he is for our country. I just try to, live in a way that, would make him proud and make his legacy worthwhile.
I was realizing the other day, I knew him for about as long as he's been gone, about 10 years. And it's a hard question, Cal. My wife, Andrea, she never got a chance to meet Chris, but obviously I talked about him. And he's someone that I have always kind of struggled to put into words. He's a very unique person. I've rarely met anyone like him. And in fact, when I do meet people who are somewhat like him, it's striking. You can kind of see, oh, wow, there's that spark or that kind of like zest to be out there doing things and engaging with new ideas. I try to get out and do things. I try to get out and learn new things. I try to get out and spend time with people and talk about big questions. Those are things I very much think I learned from Chris, or at least learned how to do in partnership or in friendship with Chris. There's this great story that my dad told me. I think I was sleeping when it happened, but my family had a cabin up in northern Minnesota, and a bunch of friends went up there one weekend, including Chris. And some of them took a pontoon out on the lake. They went kind of around this peninsula. It's not a big lake, it's maybe 100 acres. And my dad found Chris barefoot, walking up the road to the cabin and then down the driveway. And he could tell Chris had just walked barefoot down a gravel road a lot longer than he had been intending to. But I guess Chris had jumped out of the pontoon and swam to shore and decided to run or walk back to the cabin around the lake. And he didn't really know, there was a swamp in between him and the road, and the road cut around different bays and was longer than he was expecting. But that memory just sticks in my mind, because he was someone who was, if he wanted to do something, he didn't really worry about the fact that it would be hard to do or maybe uncomfortable to do. In this case, walking along a gravel road in his bare feet. He just did it and didn't complain, and showed up with sometimes a kind of a dopey smile on his face if he knew that he'd gotten a little bit over his head. And so anyway, that's a lesson that I really learned from Chris, and that is just to get out and do things. If you're concerned about the exertion or the effort or discomfort or whatever, it's probably not going to be as bad as you're worried about, and probably something good will come out of it. At least in my experience in things like that with Chris, it always did.
This really gets to how Chris has changed my life, even 10 years later. It would have been about December of 2008, and it was Chris and Kelsey's wedding, right? I remember receiving an invitation for the wedding, and to be perfectly, honest with you, shamefully and maybe quite, frankly, selfish, I really didn't give the wedding invite all that much consideration at the time. It was I don't remember where the wedding was, but I think it probably was in New Mexico. It was around Christmas time. The week after Christmas, we were getting ready. Myself, I was getting ready for Ranger School. Had a wedding coming up. Was going to be reassigned to Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, and honestly, just wanted to take that time to spend time with the family, spend time with my fiance, and before moving out to Hawaii. And so I didn't go to the wedding. Fast forward a few months later to June 2009. It was my wedding, right? Caroline and I got married up at West Point. And Chris would have, at that point, moved on from Fort Benning. He would have been presumably a brand new platoon leader with the 82nd Airborne Division, which would have required a lot of time in the field, but pretty intense time. A lot of our classmates at the time, would face some of the the same challenges, and quite frankly, some of my best friends from school who would have otherwise been in the wedding party were not able to go to our wedding, and that was completely understandable. But I remember Chris made the effort. He made the effort to come up to West Point. He made the effort, to be there for us. And that really, it certainly hit me at the time. By taking that time, by making that effort, he certainly, made us, feel special. But as fate would have it, that was the last time that we would see Chris. He went on to Fort Bragg, like I said, and then on to Afghanistan, deployed to Afghanistan, and Caroline and I went to Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, and then on to Iraq. And so, shortly after he died, I obviously spent a lot of time thinking and reflecting, and went back to our respective weddings, and was just struck by the effort that he made and the effort that I did not make. And, of course, had he not come to our wedding, I certainly wouldn't have thought any, less of him. But because he did come, because he did make that effort, like I said, he made us feel special, like we were worth his time. And so I guess the takeaway is maybe somewhat cliche, but, life is short. And, fortunately or unfortunately, many of us don't know, when we'll be making that last impression on someone. But, at least for Chris and for me, that last impression was, selfless, and it was generous, and it was giving of his time. And, of course, if I could do it all over again, I would certainly go to Chris and Kelsey's wedding. But, obviously I can't. But there really hasn't been a wedding or a graduation or any, significant life event that's, come up since where I haven't thought about Chris. And been a little bit more resolved to, be giving of my time or, my attention. And that's a direct result of his influence on my life and quite frankly, just the person that he was.
His undying love for Kelsey was always like one of the most adorable, disgusting things that we all saw. He wrote her letters, basically every day from the day he met her till the day they got married. And one of my biggest regrets in life is not going to that wedding, but it was a beautiful thing that they had, and we miss him so much.
I think about him daily, probably like many of you, wear a bracelet memorializing him and his life. And, I miss you, Chris. Looking forward to seeing you again one day. Love you.
As we come up on like the 10-year anniversary of Chris's death, I've been trying to reflect upon that a lot. Don't take yourself too seriously. Like lean into your intelligence, like be willing to share the things that you know and share your wisdom with other people, but try and stay light and keep things comical.
I really remember the community in Apple Valley where Chris is from. When we went there for the funeral, Nick and I were able to fly together. They could come home from deployment, and we were able to fly together to Apple Valley and meet. And it was almost like a homecoming. Like when we got to the airport, all of our really good friends we hadn't seen in a long time were there, and to get to meet the community that raised Chris was just an incredible experience. To get to interact with his sisters and his mom and just all of his really close friends, to get to experience that time, that season that's just so unique, where it was just so heartbreaking, but at the same time so joyful to see how his get to meet all the people who impacted his life to make him who he was when I met him as a freshman. That was a beautiful time. And I don't think a lot of people say that about funerals, but it really was a beautiful time of rejoicing over Chris's life. And I hope that this podcast, what you're getting to do, will do the same as we all get to hear stories that we probably didn't know about Chris.
I moved away from Minnesota, where we grew up, shortly after Chris passed away. I live in California now, so I'm not back here all that often. But when I am, and I get a chance to spend time with people, including Chris's family, it's clear that it's no accident that Chris was the way he was. His parents, his sisters, his brother are all just inquisitive, determined, caring, curious people who formed Chris to be the way that he was. And it's just, it's beautiful to see him live on in those ways. I'm sure I'm not the only person who's shared that he was a rare and unique and remarkable guy who I learned a lot from. And I think probably the best testament to that is just, 10 years later, when something big happens in the world or in my life or in the life of a loved one, it poses deep questions, maybe, moral dilemmas. I still think that my first reaction is kind of that I'd love to talk about this with Chris. I wonder what he would think. I remember my first thought when Chris passed away was obviously you're sad and upset and all those things that are human responses to tragedy. But I also remember there was just like this clear thought that popped into my head, and it was just like, wow, I hope today Chris found the answers to all those big questions he was always asking. And I'd love to ask him about that.
We miss Chris Goeke. We miss you a lot. And, we think about you every day.
What do you think he would want to say to all of us who are reflecting on him and thinking about him?
I don't think he would want us to be sad. Especially, I don't know what you believe, but I believe he's in heaven, and I believe he's just having a great time up there, and he's like, whatever, dude, like, this is awesome. Don't feel bad for me. Which is honestly a big part of like my being able to like heal. It's just like thinking that like, I want to be there, like, and like, he's so lucky. But I like to think that like he was proud of being a soldier, and he was proud of that part of him. But I also think that like he would say, it's not just about me, right? That there are a lot of soldiers, and there are a lot of people who were killed in action. There were a lot of people that like deserve that honor too. And so like, don't forget about them. And that humility, I think that would play a role probably. Yeah. And I guess I think, he was so good at building people up and encouraging people. And I just think that there would have been some sort of that, like I can just kind of picture him kind of meeting each of us, like where we're at, and somehow knowing exactly what we needed to hear and giving us that,
Jenny treasures this voicemail from her brother to this day.
Hey, Jen, it's Chris. On my 8-hour break from Ranger School, I passed the first phase, which is great news. So now I'm moving to the mountains tomorrow. Just want to call and let you know, and hope everything's going well on your end. I'll be able to talk to you more in hopefully a few weeks. All right. Love you. Bye.
Thank you so much to all of you that have watched or listened today. If you'd like to do something in response to this, please consider supporting the Warrior 196 Foundation. This is a 501c3 with a mission to honor and remember Chris and 4 other men from Independent School District 196 who paid the ultimate sacrifice, and they do so by providing scholarships to young leaders and support to the community. I want to leave you with one of Chris's favorite quotes. It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Theodore Roosevelt.